The medieval world often appears to us like a dusty, closed book full of simple answers. But what if the truths we think we know about women and love in those distant centuries, from around 1000 to 1450 CE, are just stories we tell ourselves? Were women truly powerless figures? Was love just a cold business deal? Get ready to question everything. Number 8. Medieval women were completely subservient and had no power. The common understanding often paints medieval women as little more than chattel, objects to be traded in marriage, with no voice or agency in a world ruled entirely by men. This image of the perpetually meek and silent woman, confined to the domestic sphere with no influence beyond the nursery, lingers stubbornly in the popular imagination. It suggests a society where women had no legal standing, no economic control, and no political sway. They were seen as perpetually under the guardianship of a father, then a husband, and if widowed, perhaps a son or another male relative. Their worth, it is often argued, was solely tied to their ability to produce heirs, particularly male ones, and to manage a household with quiet efficiency. This narrative implies a monolithic experience where every woman, from the highest queen to the lowliest peasant, was equally stripped of personal power, existing only in relation to the men who controlled their lives. It conjures an image of universal female oppression, a world where even the most intelligent and capable woman would find her ambitions stifled and her voice unheard, her very existence dependent on the whims of a male-dominated hierarchy. However, a closer look at the intricate tapestry of medieval life reveals a far more nuanced and complex reality, one where women often wielded significant, albeit sometimes indirect, power. In the absence of their husbands, whether due to war, pilgrimage, or other long absences, noblewomen frequently took on the formidable responsibility of managing vast estates, overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents, and administering justice. These women were not simply keeping the household running, they were actively governing territories, making critical economic decisions that impacted hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women of the High Middle Ages, ruled her own duchy, led crusades, and played a central role in the political intrigues of both French and English courts. Her influence stretched across kingdoms, and her actions profoundly shaped the course of European history. She was not an anomaly. Numerous noblewomen engaged in diplomacy, conducted sieges, and even defended their castles against invaders. The Countess of Derby, Blanche of Artois, for instance, managed vast English estates while her husband, Edmund Crouchback, was away, demonstrating exceptional administrative acumen. These women were not mere stand-ins, they were active, decision-making leaders. Beyond the aristocracy, women in urban centers also carved out spaces of considerable economic agency. In many towns and cities, women were active participants in various trades and crafts. They were brewers, bakers, milliners, textile workers, and even goldsmiths. Guild records from cities like Paris, London, and Florence show that women were often admitted as full members, allowing them to own businesses, train apprentices, and participate in guild governance. In some cases, specific guilds, like the silk workers or embroiderers, were predominantly female. These women operated independently, making their own financial decisions and contributing significantly to the urban economy. The widow's privilege was a particularly important legal custom that allowed widows to inherit their deceased husband's business and continue to run it, preserving their economic independence and maintaining the family's livelihood. This meant that a woman who had previously worked alongside her husband might, upon his death, become the sole proprietor of a thriving enterprise, employing others and engaging in commercial transactions that required shrewdness and authority. Their presence in the marketplace was not a quiet, behind-the-scenes affair. It was an active and visible participation in public economic life. Even within the domestic sphere, where women's influence is often dismissed as minor, their power was substantial. The medieval household was a complex economic unit, and the lady of the house, whether a noblewoman or a peasant's wife, was its chief manager. She oversaw the production and preservation of food, managed servants or family labor, controlled household budgets, and often supervised the spinning, weaving, and sewing of textiles. For a peasant woman, managing the household meant ensuring the family's survival, from planting a garden to caring for livestock, often performing tasks that required significant physical strength and strategic planning. The success or failure of the family's survival often rested heavily on her organizational skills and labor. In noble households, the lady was responsible for the well-being and training of a vast retinue of servants, and for maintaining the social status of her family through hospitality and proper conduct. She was the mistress of a small domain, and her authority within it was largely unquestioned. The concept of housewifery, or Good governance of the household was not a trivial matter. It was seen as a cornerstone of social order and economic prosperity, and the woman at its helm held considerable, albeit largely invisible, power. The spiritual realm also offered avenues for female power and authority. Abbesses of powerful convents often held significant land, controlled substantial wealth, and exercised jurisdiction over vast monastic communities. These women were not just spiritual leaders, they were formidable temporal rulers, negotiating with bishops, kings, and nobles, managing complex financial affairs, and sometimes even commanding their own vassals. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and healer whose counsel was sought by emperors and popes. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of her convent, shaping theological and scientific thought. Convents provided women with opportunities for education, intellectual development, and leadership that were often unavailable elsewhere. They were centers of learning and patronage where women could pursue scholarly interests, engage in artistic endeavors, and live lives of intellectual autonomy. The very existence of these powerful female-led institutions challenges the notion that women were universally powerless. They were not merely passive recipients of religious instruction, but active agents in shaping spiritual and intellectual life. The stories of women like Heloise, whose intellectual prowess was renowned even in her own time, or Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century canoness who wrote plays and histories, further illustrate the intellectual and artistic agency available to women within the monastic framework. These women were not defined by their relationship to a man, they were defined by their intellect, their spiritual devotion, and their administrative capabilities. Number 7. Love was purely a practical arrangement, devoid of emotion. The common understanding suggests that marriage in the medieval period was a purely utilitarian transaction, a calculated exchange of land, wealth, and lineage, with little to no room for personal affection or emotional connection. It is often portrayed as a cold, business-like arrangement, orchestrated by parents and guardians for dynastic or economic advantage, where the individuals involved had little to no say in their own destinies. This perspective implies that love, as we understand it today, a deep emotional bond, mutual affection, and personal compatibility, was a modern invention, alien to the pragmatic sensibilities of medieval society. Those marriages were about alliances between powerful families, the consolidation of territories, or the securing of social standing. The bride was a vessel for political contracts and the production of legitimate heirs, and the groom a means to expand influence or secure an inheritance. Any emerging fondness between husband and wife was considered a fortunate bonus rather than an essential component, and certainly not a prerequisite for the marital bond. This viewpoint simplifies complex human relationships into mere economic equations, stripping away the very humanity of the people involved. However, numerous sources from the medieval period, from intimate personal letters to elaborate literary works, reveal a rich tapestry of human emotions, demonstrating that love, affection, and even passion were very much part of the marital experience, and indeed, of medieval life in general. While arranged marriages were certainly common, especially among the aristocracy, this did not automatically preclude the development of genuine affection between spouses over time. Many letters between husbands and wives, even those in arranged unions, express deep fondness, concern, and longing during periods of separation. For instance, the letters of Marjorie Paston, a woman from a prominent 15th century English family, to her husband John, are filled with expressions of longing for his return, concern for his health, and shared joy in their children. She often ended her letters with phrases like, "your own loving wife" or "your very true wife," indicating a personal bond beyond mere formality. These are not the words of two strangers bound by contract, they are the words of individuals who shared a life, faced challenges together, and nurtured a personal connection. Such correspondence provides a window into the emotional lives of medieval couples, suggesting that companionship and affection were valued even if the initial match was not based on romantic love. Furthermore, among the lower classes, where property and dynastic concerns were less paramount, there was often greater flexibility in marriage choices, allowing for personal attraction to play a more significant role. While parental approval was still important, particularly for economic reasons, young men and women in villages and towns frequently had more opportunities to meet and interact, leading to unions based on mutual inclination. Village records and legal documents occasionally hint at couples choosing partners based on personal preference, sometimes even against their parents' wishes, and seeking the church's blessing for these unions. These informal courtships, often conducted through communal gatherings, dances, or work in the fields, could lead to genuine emotional attachments before any formal agreement was made. The simple economic realities of peasant life often meant that a good working partnership and personal compatibility were as important as land or goods, fostering relationships where affection could naturally flourish. The very concept of marriage, as increasingly defined by the Church throughout the medieval period, emphasized consent and the formation of a spiritual union. While pragmatic concerns remained, Church doctrines stressed that marriage was a sacrament, a bond between two individuals requiring their free will and consent, even if such consent was sometimes nominal or pressured. The Church also acknowledged and often celebrated the importance of companionship within marriage, viewing it as a remedy against sin and a source of mutual support. Sermons and theological texts often spoke of conjugal love as a virtuous and blessed state, not just a procreative necessity. This spiritual framework, while not equating to modern romantic love, certainly provided a space for affection and emotional bonding to develop within the marital relationship, elevating it beyond a purely transactional arrangement. The Church's insistence on the unbreakability of marriage, for instance, implied a commitment that went beyond a mere contract, demanding a deeper, more enduring connection. Literary sources, particularly the romances and troubadour poetry, while often depicting the idealized and sometimes unattainable concept of courtly love, also offer glimpses into the cultural appreciation for emotional connection and passionate attachment. While these works frequently focused on extramarital affairs, they nonetheless demonstrated a deep societal fascination with the intensity of romantic feelings, the pain of separation, and the joy of reunion. Characters in these stories often speak of profound love, devotion, and even obsession. While these narratives may not reflect the everyday realities of marriage, they certainly prove that the medieval mind was capable of conceiving and valorizing intense emotional bonds between individuals. The popularity of such tales suggests that their themes resonated with audiences, implying an innate understanding and appreciation for profound emotional connection, even if the specific forms it took differed from modern expectations. These stories, though fictional, provided a cultural outlet for exploring the complexities of human attraction and attachment, hinting that medieval society, despite its pragmatic structures, was far from devoid of romantic yearning and emotional depth. Number 6. Courtly love was real and practiced widely. The concept of courtly love, with its imagery of knights performing heroic deeds for unattainable ladies, secret glances, and passionate devotion, is a persistent and romanticized truth about the medieval period. It paints a picture of a refined system of love, practiced by the aristocracy, where a knight would pledge his undying devotion to a married noblewoman, often his feudal lord's wife, without expectation of physical consummation. This idealized love, often described as ennobling and spiritual, involved elaborate rituals, codes of conduct, and a hierarchy of adoration. It suggests a widespread cultural phenomenon, where the elite engaged in sophisticated emotional games, where poets sang of unrequited longing, and where chivalric virtues were intertwined with amorous pursuits. The idea implies that this complex system of romantic adoration was a common practice, shaping the relationships and social interactions among the nobility throughout Europe, creating a distinct and pervasive culture of refined romantic sentiment that permeated their daily lives and influenced their behavior. However, the reality of courtly love is far more complex and often misunderstood, revealing it to be more of a literary construct and a set of ideals than a widely practiced social reality. Courtly love, or fin amour as it was known, primarily existed in the realm of poetry, song, and aristocratic literature, flourishing in the courts of Provence and northern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. Troubadour poetry, narratives like the Arthurian romances, and theoretical treatises such as Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, the Art of Courtly Love, were the primary vehicles for this concept. These texts outline the rules and sentiments of courtly love, often presenting it as an illicit and adulterous affair, a love that could only exist outside the bonds of marriage. The very definition of courtly love, as described by Capellanus, often highlighted its clandestine nature and its unsuitability for married life, stating that pure love dwells between the sexes and provides for the attainment of all true happiness. This description of pure love was, paradoxically, often distinct from marital love, which was considered more about practicalities and procreation. The existence of such a literary tradition does not automatically mean that it was widely enacted in daily life. While noblemen and women certainly enjoyed these stories and perhaps even experimented with some of the outward forms of flirtation and adoration, the practicalities and severe consequences of actual adultery in medieval society made widespread practice of courtly love highly improbable. Adultery, especially for women, carried severe penalties ranging from public shaming to imprisonment, disfigurement, or even death, particularly if it jeopardized legitimacy of heirs. The legal and social structures of the time simply did not tolerate the sort of widespread infidelity that courtly love often implied. The very idea that noblewomen would regularly engage in such emotionally charged and potentially ruinous relationships purely for the sake of an idealized love runs counter to the practical realities of protecting family honor, lineage, and property. The literary portrayal often glossed over these severe social consequences, focusing instead on the romantic ideal. Furthermore, Capellanus's De Amore, often cited as the definitive guide to courtly love, is a highly ambiguous text that might have been intended as satire, a cautionary tale, or simply a rhetorical exercise rather than a practical handbook. Some scholars argue that its extreme pronouncements and contradictions, such as advising men to seek the love of married women while also condemning certain forms of love as sinful, suggest an ironic intent. If the primary rulebook for courtly love was itself a complex and potentially satirical work, it casts doubt on how seriously its tenets were embraced as a social code. The text itself reveals a philosophical debate about the nature of love rather than a straightforward description of widespread practice. The idea that courts across Europe uniformly adopted these complex and sometimes contradictory rules for romantic engagement seems unlikely, given the regional differences in customs and laws. The concept of courtly love also served as a form of social critique or a playful intellectual game within aristocratic circles. It provided a framework for discussing emotional complexities, gender roles, and social expectations without necessarily advocating for their literal enactment. Knights might have performed brave deeds in tournaments in honor of a lady, but this was often a public display of chivalry and martial prowess, a performance of honor, rather than a sign of a clandestine romantic affair. Such gestures were part of the elaborate rituals of aristocratic life, a means of displaying virtue and attracting patronage rather than a true reflection of widespread secret romantic relationships. The literary emphasis on suffering for love or service to the lady can be interpreted as a metaphor for the knight's dedication to his lord, his faith, or his own ideals, rather than a literal commitment to a forbidden romantic liaison. The narratives often presented extreme, almost absurd scenarios of devotion, which likely served more as entertainment and a way to explore emotional extremes than as a guide for real-world conduct. Finally, the geographical and temporal limitations of courtly love further question its widespread application. It was predominantly a phenomenon of the High Middle Ages in certain parts of France, though it spread to some extent across Europe. Its intensity waned after the 13th century, giving way to different forms of romantic expression in later medieval literature. While its influence on Western concepts of romance is undeniable, it was not a universal, unchanging practice that permeated all levels of medieval society or endured throughout the entire period. To view it as a ubiquitous truth of medieval love affairs is to ignore its specific historical context and its primary existence as a sophisticated, and often paradoxical, literary tradition rather than a common social custom. Its enduring popularity as a modern concept often reflects our own romantic ideals projected onto the past rather than a true understanding of medieval social realities. Number 5, medieval women were uneducated and illiterate. A persistent truth about medieval women asserts that they lived largely uneducated lives, confined to a realm of domestic duties, with no access to formal schooling or literacy. This view suggests that learning was exclusively for men, particularly for the clergy and certain segments of the nobility, leaving the vast majority of women, regardless of social standing, unable to read, write, or engage in intellectual pursuits. It paints a picture of a society where women were deliberately kept ignorant, their intellectual capacities deemed secondary or irrelevant to their primary roles as wives and mothers. This widespread misconception implies that even basic literacy was a rare privilege for women, reducing their intellectual landscape to the practicalities of household management and religious devotion, and limiting their ability to participate in the broader cultural and intellectual life of the period. However, historical evidence reveals a far more diverse and often surprising reality concerning female literacy and education in the Middle Ages. While formal schooling might not have been as widespread for girls as for boys in certain periods or regions, access to education varied significantly across social classes and geographical locations, and many women achieved high levels of literacy and intellectual accomplishment. For aristocratic women, education often took place within the home, under the tutelage of private tutors or chaplains. These noblewomen were frequently taught to read and write, not only in their vernacular language, but also in Latin, the language of scholarship and the church. They were educated in history, theology, music, and sometimes even medicine. Christine de Pizan, an extraordinary 15th century author and intellectual, was educated by her father, a court astrologer and physician to Charles V of France. she became a prolific writer, historian, and philosopher, producing works that critically examined gender roles and celebrated female achievements, such as the Book of the City of Ladies. Her work stands as a testament to the intellectual capabilities of women who received comprehensive education. Monasteries and convents provided a particularly important avenue for female education and intellectual development. Many convents maintained extensive libraries and functioned as centers of learning, where nuns not only learned to read and write but also engaged in scholarly pursuits, copied manuscripts, composed music, and wrote theological treatises. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen were not only spiritual leaders, but also celebrated intellectuals, writers, and composers whose works were widely known and respected throughout Europe. The existence of these female-led intellectual communities demonstrates that women were not only capable of learning, but actively pursued knowledge and contributed significantly to the intellectual landscape of the age. For many women, monastic life offered a unique opportunity for intellectual autonomy and scholarly engagement that might have been unavailable to them in secular society. Beyond the nobility and the monastic orders, literacy was also present among women in urban centers, particularly those involved in trade and commerce. Wives of merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers often needed to read and write to assist with family businesses, keep accounts, manage correspondence, and handle legal documents. In many medieval towns, women ran their own shops or managed family enterprises, tasks that frequently required a degree of literacy for record-keeping and correspondence. Guild records and legal documents occasionally reveal women signing their names, indicating at least a functional level of literacy. While basic literacy might have been geared towards practical ends, it nonetheless allowed these women to engage with written culture and conduct their affairs with greater independence. The ability to read bills of sale, contracts, or even letters from suppliers was an economic necessity for many working women. Furthermore, evidence from private devotional books, often beautifully illuminated, indicates that many women, even those not of the highest social strata, owned and could read these texts. These prayer books, psalters, and books of hours were popular among both men and women, and their widespread ownership suggests a significant degree of lay literacy, particularly among pious women who wished to engage directly with religious texts. The very existence of these books, designed for personal use, implies an audience capable of reading them. While reading religious texts might not be considered formal education in a modern sense, it demonstrates a widespread functional literacy that allowed women to participate actively in their spiritual lives and engage with written material beyond simple signing. The ability to read allowed women to interpret religious doctrine for themselves, to engage with sermons and theological arguments, and to deepen their personal faith in an intellectual way. Even among peasant women, while formal literacy was rare, they possessed a vast body of practical knowledge and oral traditions that constituted a form of education. They learned medicinal remedies, agricultural practices, midwifery, and textile production through observation and apprenticeship within their communities and families. This informal education was crucial for the survival and well-being of their households and communities, and it required intelligence, memory, and practical application. While it might not involve books, it was a complex system of knowledge transfer that enabled women to manage essential aspects of daily life and contribute vitally to the household economy. To dismiss them as uneducated, simply because they were not formally literate, is to misunderstand the diverse forms of knowledge and intelligence that existed in medieval society. Number 4. Women were only valued for their beauty and ability to bear children. A persistent truth, suggests that a medieval woman's worth was almost exclusively determined by her physical attractiveness and her capacity to produce healthy offspring, especially male heirs. This narrow view implies that once a woman passed childbearing age, or if she was deemed unattractive, her value diminished significantly, relegating her to a marginal existence. It suggests that a woman's intellect, character, skills, or even her social connections held little significance compared to her fertility and youthful appearance. This perspective reduces women to biological vessels and ornamental figures, fostering the idea that their societal role was solely tied to procreation and aesthetic appeal, and that any other attributes were secondary or irrelevant in a patriarchal society obsessed with lineage and physical prowess. However, a closer examination of medieval society reveals that women were valued for a much broader array of qualities, including their intelligence, piety, administrative skills, lineage, and their capacity for companionship. While beauty and fertility were certainly desirable, especially in the context of dynastic marriages, they were far from the only, or even always the primary, determinants of a woman's worth. A woman's social standing and the power of her family lineage often held immense weight in marital negotiations, sometimes overshadowing personal beauty. A bride from a powerful family brought Not only potential heirs, but also strategic alliances, land, and wealth, all of which were crucial for maintaining or advancing a family's status. Such considerations often took precedence over a woman's physical attributes, particularly in the upper echelons of society. Beyond the initial marriage contract, a woman's administrative abilities were highly prized. As discussed previously, noblewomen were often responsible for managing vast estates in their husband's absence, a role that required sharp intellect, strong leadership, and excellent organizational skills. A woman who could effectively oversee agricultural production, manage household finances, handle legal disputes, and entertain guests was invaluable to her family's prosperity and reputation. For example, during the Hundred Years' War, many English and French noblewomen effectively governed their lordships for decades while their husbands were away fighting. Their ability to maintain order, secure revenues, and even defend castles was a testament to their administrative competence, and these skills were highly respected and necessary. A wife who could successfully manage a large household, be it a castle or a merchant's home, was considered a highly capable and esteemed partner far beyond mere physical appearance. Piety and moral virtue were also deeply valued attributes in medieval women. A woman's devotion to the church, her charitable acts, and her adherence to moral standards were seen as essential qualities, reflecting positively not only on her own character but also on her family's reputation. On women who exemplified piety, such as saints or revered figures, often gained immense social and spiritual influence. The concept of the good Christian woman encompassed virtues like humility, chastity, and charity, but also wisdom and a deep understanding of religious doctrine. A woman who could articulate theological concepts, offer spiritual guidance, or simply lead a morally upright life was considered a cornerstone of her community and a source of spiritual strength for her family. This spiritual value was distinct from, and often considered superior to, fleeting physical beauty. Furthermore, a woman's role as a companion and partner within marriage grew in importance throughout the later Middle Ages. While initial marriages might have been arranged, many couples developed deep emotional bonds and intellectual partnerships. The concept of a good wife often included her ability to offer counsel, emotional support, and shared interest to her husband. Letters and chronicles occasionally speak of husbands valuing their wives' wisdom and companionship, suggesting a deeper connection than mere procreation. This companionship extended to intellectual discourse, with some women participating in learned discussions or acting as patrons of arts and letters. The rise of private devotional practices and shared literacy within households further fostered such companionship, where husbands and wives might read together or discuss spiritual matters. Even in old age, when beauty and fertility were clearly no longer factors, women retained significant social value. Elderly women, particularly widows, often commanded respect for their accumulated wisdom, experience, and their role as matriarchs. They might become trusted advisors within their families, holding considerable informal authority and influence over their children and grandchildren. They were often responsible for passing down traditions, managing family legacies, and acting as guardians for younger relatives. Their knowledge of family history, property, and local customs made them indispensable figures. The dowager, or lady mother, often held her own dower lands, giving her economic independence and a base of power that ensured her continued influence long after her childbearing years were over. Their wisdom and experience, rather than their diminishing physical attributes, became their new and enduring source of value. Number 3, marriages were always arranged and coerced. A widely held truth about medieval marriages suggests that they were universally arranged by parents or guardians, often with little to no regard for the feelings or desires of the bride and groom. This perception implies that young people, especially women, had no agency in choosing their partners, being merely pawns in a strategic game of alliances, land, and wealth. It conjures an image of forced unions where individuals were compelled into marital bonds, often against their will, with coercion being the norm rather than the exception. This view suggests a complete absence of personal choice, painting a picture of individuals trapped in predetermined relationships with no legal or social recourse if they objected to their assigned partner. However, the historical reality of medieval marriage practices was far more varied and complex, with consent, even if sometimes nominal, playing a crucial role and instances of elopement and personal choice being more common than often assumed. While arranged marriages were indeed prevalent, particularly among the aristocracy and wealthy merchant classes where dynastic and economic considerations were paramount, the Church's increasing emphasis on consent gradually shifted the legal and spiritual landscape of marriage. From the 12th century onwards, the church held that for a marriage to be valid, both parties had to freely consent to the union. While parental pressure was often immense, particularly for noble marriages, outright coercion could invalidate the marriage in the eyes of the church. This legal framework, though often challenging to enforce against powerful families, provided a theoretical basis for individual agency. This emphasis on consent led to various strategies for young people to assert their preferences, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Secret marriages, where a couple exchanged vows without parental knowledge or permission, were not uncommon. While such unions were often frowned upon and could lead to disinheritance or social ostracism, they were nevertheless considered valid by the church if consummated. The records exist of couples seeking the church's protection against parental attempts to annul such secret unions, demonstrating that individuals actively fought for their chosen partners. For instance, the famous story of Heloise and Abelard, though tragic, began with a secret marriage, highlighting the existence of unions entered into without prior family approval. While their circumstances were extraordinary, the legal validity of their secret vows was a key point of their conflict. Among the lower classes, particularly peasants and urban workers, the economic pressures and social structures often allowed for greater flexibility in marriage choices. While parents might still have a say, especially concerning the dowry or bride price, young men and women frequently had more opportunities to meet and interact in communal settings, such as village gatherings, markets, or shared labor. This allowed for personal attraction and compatibility to play a larger role in partner selection. Marriages in these communities were often based more on mutual inclination and the practical need for a working partnership, rather than elaborate dynastic alliances. Church records often show local customs that permitted young people to make their own choices, even if those choices were still vetted by community elders. The economic realities of running a small farm or an artisan's workshop often meant that finding a suitable and compatible partner was as important as any material considerations, fostering relationships where personal affection could naturally grow. Even within arranged marriages, consent was frequently sought, albeit sometimes formally. The bride and groom might be presented with their intended partner, and their agreement, however reluctantly given, was often required. This formal consent, while perhaps not representing true emotional willingness, at least acknowledged the individual's role in the union. Moreover, the long betrothal periods common among the nobility sometimes allowed the betrothed couple to spend time together and develop a degree of familiarity, and sometimes even affection, before the formal marriage. These periods could allow for the development of rapport, turning a purely strategic match into one with some emotional foundation. If a betrothal was truly abhorrent to one party, they might appeal to powerful figures or the church for intervention, though such appeals were risky and rarely successful without significant influence. Furthermore, legal codes and social customs provided some protections against outright coercion. While the balance of power heavily favored parents and guardians, outright physical force to compel marriage was generally illegal and condemned. If a marriage was proven to be forced through duress, it could be annulled. While such instances were rare and difficult to prove, their very existence in legal discussions suggests that society recognized the principle of free consent, even if its practical application was often imperfect. The stories of women like Agnes Sorel, mistress to King Charles VII of France, or those who chose monastic life to escape unwanted marriages, suggest that women found diverse ways to exert agency, even in a system that often restricted their choices. These examples, though not everyday occurrences, demonstrate that the truth of universally coerced marriage is an oversimplification of a complex and evolving social landscape. Number 2. Medieval women were always chaste and modest. The common understanding often holds that medieval women were expected to embody absolute chastity and unwavering modesty, presenting a public image of purity and moral uprightness. This truth suggests a society where female sexuality was rigidly controlled, confined strictly within the bounds of marriage and procreation, and where any deviation from this norm was met with severe condemnation. It paints a picture of women cloaked in demure garments, their conduct meticulously regulated, and their very thoughts supposedly directed towards piety and virtuous living. This ideal often implies that women themselves internalize these strictures, living lives devoid of sexual desire outside of marital duty, and that illicit sexual activity among women was virtually non-existent, or if it occurred, was hidden in the deepest shadows, never publicly acknowledged. However, historical records, legal documents, and literary works from the medieval period present a far more complex and often contradictory picture of female sexuality and conduct, revealing that premarital sex, adultery, and even professional prostitution were realities of medieval life, and that modesty, while an ideal, was not universally practiced or perfectly enforced. While chastity was indeed a highly praised virtue, especially for unmarried women and widows, human nature and social realities meant that not everyone adhered strictly to these ideals. Evidence from court records, for instance, frequently details cases of illicit sexual activity, including fornication and adultery, committed by both men and women across various social strata. These records often focus on punishment or legal disputes, implicitly acknowledge the existence of such behaviors rather than denying them outright. Prostitution, far from being entirely suppressed, was often a legally recognized and regulated profession in medieval towns and cities across Europe. The municipalities sometimes established public brothels, often called stews or bordellos, to manage and control the practice. These establishments were frequently taxed by city authorities, and their inhabitants were subject to specific rules and regulations, such as curfews or dress codes. In some cities, like London or Paris, these brothels were located in specific districts and operated openly, indicating a societal acceptance of prostitution as a necessary evil to control male sexual urges and maintain order rather than a universal enforcement of female chastity. The existence of these regulated institutions directly challenges the notion that all women were expected to be or successfully maintained a state of absolute sexual purity outside of marriage. Furthermore, the social expectation of modesty in dress and behavior, while strong, was often challenged or interpreted differently. While sumptuary laws attempted to regulate clothing based on social status and moral expectations, medieval art and literature occasionally depict women in less than demure attire or engaging in flirtatious behavior. Bawdy tales, jokes, and songs, often found in popular culture, reveal a more earthy and less prudish understanding of sexuality than the idealized image suggests. The famous French fabliaux, short comic tales, often feature sexually adventurous women, mischievous wives, and illicit encounters, suggesting that medieval society, despite its moral strictures, had a robust, if often subversive, sense of humor about sexual matters. These popular narratives, while not prescriptive, reflect a cultural understanding of human desire that extended beyond the confines of strict religious dogma. Moreover, while adultery was a sin and a serious offense, the consequences often differed significantly for men and women. A man's adultery, while condemned, often carried less severe social repercussions than a woman's, especially if the woman's adultery jeopardized the legitimacy of heirs. This double standard implicitly acknowledges that illicit sexual activity was not solely the domain of men, and that women also engaged in it, but faced harsher penalties. The narratives of cuckolded husbands and the public shaming of unfaithful wives attest to the societal awareness and concern regarding female fidelity, precisely because it was not always a given. The Church's tireless efforts to preach chastity and condemn fornication also highlight the fact that these behaviors were prevalent and needed constant suppression rather than being naturally absent from society. Finally, the concept of modesty itself was nuanced. While outwardly demure behavior was praised, women sometimes used fashion and personal adornment to express social status, wealth, and even attractiveness within certain bounds. The intricate hairstyles, elaborate head coverings, and rich fabrics depicted in medieval portraits suggest a sophisticated understanding of presentation and allure, rather than an absolute suppression of female presence. While physical modesty was preached, the human desire for attraction and self-expression often found ways to manifest within societal norms. The very existence of saints' lives, which often lauded the extreme chastity of female figures, paradoxically highlights the prevalence of the sin of unchastity in society, making the saint's virtue all the more remarkable by contrast. The historical record, therefore, reveals a medieval world, where the ideals of chastity and modesty were perpetually in tension with the complex realities of human desire and social practices. Number 1. Women had no legal rights or protections. The widespread truth concerning medieval women often asserts that they possessed virtually no legal standing or rights, existing entirely at the mercy of male authority figures. This view suggests that women could not own property, conduct business, initiate lawsuits, or protect themselves from abuse, portraying them as entirely disenfranchised within a legal system that solely served the interests of men. It implies a monolithic legal landscape across Europe, where women were uniformly treated as legal minors, perpetually under the guardianship of a father, husband, or other male relative, with no independent legal identity or means of recourse, regardless of their social standing or individual circumstances. This common narrative paints a grim picture of universal legal powerlessness for medieval women, suggesting that justice and protection were concepts wholly unattainable for them. However, a detailed examination of medieval legal systems and social customs reveals a far more intricate and often surprising reality, demonstrating that women possessed a range of legal rights and protections, though these varied significantly by region, social class, and historical period. While patriarchy was certainly a dominant force, women were not entirely excluded from legal participation or the exercise of property rights. One of the most significant protections for married women was the concept of dower or dowry, depending on the legal tradition, though they are often confused. Dower was the portion of a deceased husband's estate, typically one-third, set aside for his widow's support. This land or income was legally hers for life and could not be alienated by her husband during his lifetime. This ensured that widows, even those whose husbands died without male heirs, had a guaranteed source of income and a degree of economic independence. And widows were often legally capable of holding and managing their dower lands, conducting legal transactions related to them, and defending their rights in court. This provided a significant form of social and economic security for women who outlived their husbands. Furthermore, single women, including spinsters and widows, often possessed more extensive legal rights than married women. As feme sole, they could enter into contracts, buy and sell property, initiate lawsuits, and represent themselves in court without the need for a male guardian. Many women in urban centers, particularly wealthy merchants' daughters or widows, actively managed businesses, traded goods, and engaged in financial transactions, all of which required them to operate within the legal framework as independent entities. Records from various towns and cities, such as London, Paris, and Florence, show women running shops, engaging in various trades like brewing, baking, or textile production, and even being members of guilds, which often entailed specific legal protections and responsibilities. These women were not just assisting their husbands, they were proprietors in their own right, legally recognized and capable of defending their commercial interests. Even married women, though legally considered under the coverture of their husbands in many common law systems, still retained certain protections and indirect means of legal recourse. In some legal traditions, a married woman could inherit property, particularly personal effects and movable goods, which remained her own. While her husband might manage the property, it was understood to be her inheritance. But moreover, in cases of spousal abuse or abandonment, women could sometimes seek legal intervention from church courts, which often heard cases related to marriage, divorce, and domestic disputes. While justice was not always perfect or easily obtained, the availability of such avenues indicates that women were not entirely without recourse against harm within their marriages. The church courts, in particular, provided a forum where women could bring grievances related to the sacred bond of marriage, appealing to a higher moral authority. In various regional legal codes, such as those found in parts of Scandinavia or Germanic lands, women often held more extensive inheritance rights, sometimes inheriting equally with male siblings or inheriting specific types of property. The concept of separate property for married women also existed in some areas, allowing them to retain control over assets brought into the marriage or acquired independently. These diverse legal customs illustrate that the legal status of women was not uniform across the medieval world, but varied significantly, offering different levels of autonomy and protection. The existence of these varied legal frameworks challenges the idea of a universal state of female legal powerlessness. Finally, women frequently appeared as witnesses in legal proceedings, brought complaints, and defended themselves in court, demonstrating their recognition as legal persons capable of giving testimony and asserting their rights. Chronicles and court rolls provide numerous examples of women involved in lawsuits, ranging from property disputes to criminal accusations, acting as both plaintiffs and defendants. While legal proceedings were undoubtedly challenging for anyone in the medieval period, the participation of women in these formal processes underscores their legal presence and the avenues available to them, however imperfectly, to seek justice or protect their interests. Their legal capacity, though often constrained by social norms and male authority, was far from non-existent, painting a more nuanced picture of their place within the complex legal landscape of the Middle Ages.